Most school leaders prefer to focus on education rather than politics. But whether you like it or not, we operate inside a political system, one that shapes funding, taxation, and the long-term future of our schools. In this episode, Graham Catt joins me to explore what advocacy demands in a politicised environment, why building relational capital is essential before you try to spend it, and what school leaders can learn about leading when you don't have authority, only influence. Welcome to the Independent School Podcast with me, Juliet Corbett. I'm a trusted advisor, executive coach and strategist, working with accomplished leaders who are navigating complex challenges, the kind that can feel like a tangled ball of string, confusing, frustrating, and hard to unpick. In this new series, I bring you real-world conversations with principals, heads, and CEOs of independent and international schools. Together, we explore problem-solving in uncertainty, staying strategic amidst the daily bustle of leadership, and building high-performing teams. Today, I'm joined by Graham Catt, Chief Executive Officer of Independent Schools Australia, the national peak body representing over 1,200 independent schools across Australia. If you've listened to my earlier conversations with Julie Robinson, Chief Executive of the Independent Schools Council in the UK, you'll have heard about how these national bodies play a really critical role in representing and advocating for their sectors at a national level. Graham leads the equivalent organisation in Australia, operating at the intersection of education and politics. In contrast to most of my guests here, Graham is not a career educator. Instead, he brings more than 20 years' experience leading professional and industry associations across health, business, agriculture, and now education. His expertise lies in advocacy, stakeholder engagement, and helping sectors to adapt in rapidly changing political environments. So in this conversation, we explore the difference between representation and advocacy, the idea of being both a credible friend as well as a credible threat, and what it really takes to influence political decisions that affect schools. We also look at what school leaders can learn about when they're leading without direct authority, and why influence, relationships, and what Graham calls a bucket of capital can be far more powerful than hierarchical authority. So let's jump into my conversation with Graham Catt. Hello, Graham, and welcome to the Independent School Podcast.
Thanks for having me,
with us
Juliet.
Here today. So before we launch into understanding a lot more detail about the Australian independent school sector, what I'd really like to understand is you are delightfully different to most of my guests because you're not a career educator. You've come in with 20 plus years of experience leading professional and industry associations, which gives you a completely different viewpoint on what we're going to be talking about today. What was it 3-4 years ago that gave you the sense that you wanted to come into the education sector and really advocate for this sector? Is there a reason you're doing this role?
There's probably more than one, Juliet, and I had to answer that question for myself. Why do I want this role? I want to be purpose-driven. I don't take a role for the money. I moved on from something I was quite happy with, and why would I want to be here? And the reasons came down to two key things. One was, at that time, there had just been a change of government in Australia, and I think the opportunity to engage with that new Labor government in a new setting, in a federal setting, was a very attractive one. And then the question of, well, in what policy area do I want to engage was an interesting one too. And the opportunity came up with Independent Schools Australia to move into education. And when I thought it through, I thought, well, education really intersects with all of these different areas. If we're talking about the environment, if we're talking about the whole range of issues that are particularly important to the country right now, education actually sits at the centre of them and connects with all of them. What a fascinating place to be. So that was my theoretical construct. My other reason is I'm the parent of two children. I've got two teenage daughters. They both, as it happened, go to an independent school. So even as I went through the interview process, it was pretty clear to me that I sort of had skin in the game. And that lens of being able to say, I'm not just a policy person or working in this. I've actually got a real interest and a real stake in this, and I'm a parent, and I can cast that lens over what I do. From the very first interview I actually had with the board, actually really fascinated me and drove me. And I've noticed that in my team as well, that we talk about being purpose-driven, but I think all of our team have got some connection with the sector, and they're able to use that lens to look at this not just as a theoretical thing, but to say, well, this is how it might relate to me as a parent or might relate to me as a family. And I've got to say, nearly 3 years on, I started this role in April 22. I don't regret the decision at all. I'm still learning. Yeah. I learn every day, and that's the fantastic thing about moving into a new sector like this as well.
Yeah. What's really interesting is we don't want to be basing our decisions on our personal experience all the time. It's not like anecdotal leadership. Anecdotes aren't a great source of kind of evidence-based decision making. But when we think about what makes us really passionate about what we do, having that personal connection to the sector that we're working in just adds that extra layer to it. And what's wonderful about the education sector is all of us have been through it at some point. We may also have children that are going through it or have been through it. But even if that experience was positive or negative, doesn't really matter. We all have a sense of we want to do better. We want to improve the education sector because we've experienced it and the impact that it's had, whether that was to its full potential or not in our own lives.
And it's something I've come to appreciate, that it's one of the things, having worked in many other sectors, when you think about the outcomes and the people and the purpose and what we serve, education is very unusual because we are talking about 12 years in the case of Australia minimum, more than that if you were to connect that to early childhood education, more than that if you connect it to tertiary study or higher education. This is a significant period of a person's life that we're actually shaping and influencing. And I've worked in health with doctors. The drive in healthcare is to get people out of the system as soon as you possibly could. That could be an overnight stay, it could be a 3-year treatment, it could be a 10-year. But education, I think it's quite unique from a policy setting in that the ultimate role that we are playing is about shaping someone's life and shaping it over such a very, very long period of time. So someone who does what I do and works with various sectors, this is a fascinating one. And I do understand, I think it's not necessarily often articulated, but when I look at educators and their passion, I think a lot of that passion actually comes from what that very unique role that they play in a person's life. You don't see that in a whole lot of other places.
No, absolutely. And at a really formative stage of that life as well. It's the duration and kind of the depth of impact that it has during that time as well. So explain to us a little bit more. I'm going to be really blunt. What is it that you do? Because I think there's a kind of a veil of mystery around what we mean by advocacy, what we mean by policy work. What is it? How do you look at this? How do you think about what it is that Independent Schools Australia's role is?
Yeah, I'm going to go back step, and I'm going to answer it from my personal point of view, because I've, over 20 years of doing this again, and it's an interesting thing because not many people understand what we do. So if you have what we call the barbecue conversation in Australia, I don't know what you call it there, but it's when you go to a barbecue and someone says what you do. Yeah. Someone says I'm a real estate agent. Someone else says I work in a bank. You say, well, I'm the CEO of the ... association. People look at you bluntly. So as the CEO of the veterinary association, people, oh, so you're a vet, and then you go through this long process of trying to explain that you're not a vet. So I've had to kind of ponder, what, as opposed to where do I work, what is it I actually do? And over 20 years for me, I've come to the conclusion that what I have been able to do is help sectors or professions or groups of people effectively adapt to change in their world. And I started my first role like this was with general practitioners at a time when we were seeing the corporatisation and the formation from the GP being one back practice down on the street to being big corporate groups, and have continued to grow. And the same thing when I work with pharmacists, the same thing when I work with small business. So I've sort of come to that conclusion that that's what it's about. It's about actually helping a sector, profession, change and adapt to the future. So that's my kind of framing for how I adapt to this. So when I think about what we do as Independent Schools Australia, we are part of a federation. I have 8 members, and those members support 1,230 schools that are spread right across the country. If you know Australia, we have states and territories, and each of those states and territories has an association, and they're our member. In one sense, what we are there to do is to engage with our federal government in a federated structure, and they are there to engage with their state governments and support their schools. And that's the kind of explanation of the barbecue that was already leaving people confused. We talk about advocacy and we talk about policy, and I think one way, when I came into this role, I was really hired because I'm an experienced advocate. And we have had people in this role before that have been very experienced educators. It's not uncommon to find very, very experienced educators who've come through that pathway in these association roles. But in my role and in a few of our member organisations, we're seeing a trend where you get people like me. I don't know about the subject matter, but I do know about the context and the environment that we're working in. I think it reflects the fact the environment has changed, where I think once the best asset you had was a really experienced educator, because my impression is a lot of the way the policy was determined and driven was by fairly technical people on our side talking to other fairly technical people on the other side who all understood policy and coming to some sort of consensus and moving on. That's not the environment that we are working in, and it's not the environment I know that you are working in the UK. It's intensely political. So while that still needs to happen, we actually need to be more savvy, more pointy, and engaging politically as well. So my kind of construct coming into this role is I saw a lot of what I would call representation. I saw a lot of us actually engaging with governments and policymakers in forums, in committees. And a lot of that work is, a policy is being formed. Someone goes along and says, but this will affect independent schools in this way, and that's not going to work. We need you to change the policy. And we sort of perceive that as being advocacy in many ways. And it is a very important element of advocacy. I would call it representation. And it is supported by research and evidence, which is another very important part of advocacy. But on its own, it isn't enough to shift. It wouldn't be enough to shift your government's decision to put a VAT on school fees. It wouldn't be enough to shift our government. So that's what I would think of as policy or representation. And what I think of as advocacy is far more the pointy end. So we just ran the first election campaign we ran nationally with me in the role. And the sort of mantra we tried to educate people about was this concept of credible friend and credible threat. When I talk to a politician or to a government, I need to be able to say, look, we're here to be your friend. Your agenda might be X. We can help you achieve that agenda. Here's how we can help you achieve that agenda if it's a good one. But we also need to be able to say, if you do the wrong thing, if you do something that is detrimental to our families, our schools, our sector as a whole, we are able to and we are prepared to actually become a credible threat. And for politicians, I've got to be very blunt. There is only one thing that drives that, and that is votes. So it's been a real education piece it's been fascinating to go through that with our sector because we did move into a stance that I don't think we'd seen so broadly before. I think we've had various people that understood and prosecuted that kind of approach in the past. But I think we tried to engage our whole sector in this notion of let's unify behind a message. Let's understand that there is risk, and the risk is not dissimilar to the risk that you would have seen over the recent years in the UK. And let's understand that we need to be political in order to get that message across to our politicians, that we can be a threat and we do need to mobilise and can mobilise. And now we're not there yet, but it has been a fascinating process, in many ways sort of the beginning of the journey of advocacy, I think, and strong advocacy for the sector.
Yeah. What's really interesting actually is I can see the pattern in what you're sharing is actually that if you've always helped a sector or a group of professionals to adapt through change, normally they're not initiating at least all of that change. That change is happening to them, and so they are adapting as they go. What you're actually describing is a step change in the way that the whole sector needs to adapt in order to integrate itself and have a productive dialogue with the shift from technocratic policy making into a much more politicized environment. So actually what you're describing is one of the biggest ways that you're at the moment guiding that sector to understand the politicized
And the
role
challenge
and the
we
environment
have,
that they
Juliet,
play.
it's a little bit different in context to the UK, is that because there is so much, because of the funding model we have in Australia, and there is significant funding to independent schools that, it sort of blows the minds of many people when I talk about from other countries. So
give us that in a nutshell, because I've worked in Australia and it blew my mind when I arrived or when I was interviewing.
So
it is very different.
The fundamental principle in Australia is that every student, no matter what school they attend, receives funding from the government. So if you attend an independent school, you receive funding from the government. It's discounted compared to a government school or a state school, or if you attend a Catholic school, you receive funding from the government. But as a result of that, every independent school receives some funding. The other result of that becomes a very complicated funding model. In essence, the wealthier the parent cohort, the less funding those students receive. So when we see our largest, most visible, most historic schools, the ones that tend to find themselves in the media or have all the attention, they would receive the least amount of funding per student. That might be $3,000 a year. Whereas we've seen increasing growth in small, suburban, often Christian schools. Those schools might be getting $15,000 a year. And the state school across the road would be getting $23,000 to $24,000 a year. Yeah. But the concept for many that every school, no matter where, is getting some funding from the government is a very different one. And what that means is, as a peak body, when I talk about adapting to the future, our challenge is we are so focused on protecting that status quo, as you would be. Don't let them take the funding away, that in actual fact, we are probably still struggling to say, well, as we do that, it's a vanguard action to me. As we do that, yes, we should be doing that. But what we also need to be doing is, let's anticipate a world in 10 or 15 years' time. I think most people intuitively believe that model won't be there forever. So what are we doing to adapt ourselves so when the world does change, that isn't going to hurt us? How do we reinvent? How do we reimagine? And what does education and schooling look like in that new world? How do we play a part in something that's exciting? And that getting that balance right between protection of status quo as our advocacy piece and actually shaping our future that we can prosper in and our children can prosper in. I think that's the really fascinating thing for where we are a little bit stuck at the moment, I think, in terms of our roles as peak body.
Yeah, and it adds another layer of complexity and uncertainty to the whole piece, because there is a multitude of different timeframes over which you're planning and thinking, different levels of uncertainty. Obviously, the further the time frame, the more uncertainty you would normally expect to be within a scenario that you might be painting a picture of. But actually, there's significant uncertainty and complexity just from the fact that we're dealing with people, both within our schools, within our school community, so the families, and within government. This is all people driven. And so the complexity of the psychology, the personalities, the politics that's happening and whirling around all the time as well, even in a mid-election cycle where there's a little bit more of a settled sense of who's where doing what, all of that complexity and uncertainty is still there. So what are your ways of dealing with, what are your ways of thinking? It's not dealing with, thinking about. How do you think about the complexity and uncertainty that you're navigating each day?
Yes, it's a good question. I'm very fond of the notion, it's an old one, but a good one, of getting up onto the balcony. I think it's one that we consciously need to hold in our minds and feel when we're not. Like I strongly feel when I'm down on the dance floor being jostled around by other people and And I think, being able to consciously say, I've got to get out of here, I've got to carve out the space, I've got to be able to find my way up, and have a look down and try and see what's actually going on here is really a key thing. And I think it's a key thing because that's what we need to give to our other leaders, to our teams, if we're going to actually play that role of coaching and supporting. And we need to see clearly. It's not necessary that we should expect them to see that clearly themselves, but we actually need to get that perspective. So I think getting perspective is the first part of that. I think I heard you on one of your podcasts, Juliet, talk about that notion of a tangled ball of string. And that's one I remember hearing, must be well over a decade ago. And I love that. And I do that with my family as well, as to go, that I actually say that's a ball of string. You need to untangle it, tease out the threads. What is it that is making this ball of string, and how do you deal with that? So there is a lot of complexity going on. And I think one of the challenges in an organisation like ours as well is that we work in a world where the complexity is there in the environment, and navigating a way through that is difficult enough to begin with. But we also work in a world where, I've learned this over many, many years, that, the fact that I'm the CEO has very little bearing on achieving the outcome that you want to achieve. So one of the things that's always coming back at me is clarity. There's never enough clarity. I would say I'm just looking at my team's sort of feedback process over the last few weeks, and there will always be, I'm not clear, he moves the goalposts, all those things. It is the nature of working in our environment in many ways. To achieve a goal, we need to influence a great many people to achieve the goal, generally none of whom we have any actual power over or authority over. So it's simple to go, we have to influence them. But I think the other challenge of that is we need to be very nimble, and we need to be prepared to take 2 steps forward and then 4 steps back, and then do that over and over and over again. And that's exhausting. It's really tiring. And I think that challenge of complexity is one that perhaps we underestimate for ourselves. It's tiring. I'm lucky. I kind of revel in that. So I think that's why I've stayed in these jobs for 20 years. I learned actually I'm quite good at it, and I enjoy it. It stimulates me. But one of my challenges, it doesn't stimulate everyone. It frustrates people. It tires them out. It drains them. They look at me and go, well, what kind of leader are you? Because you can't just get from point A to point B with situational authority. You've got to sort of take them along on that journey. So, I think that it's okay for us to be adept at doing that piece and influencing and being savvy and getting to our goal, but leaving the people that we're leading behind and having them scratching their heads and wondering why you did that and why you did that differently, and it's inconsistent, not transparent. And actually, I think that's the other part of the challenge, and it's a much greater challenge, is how do we keep everyone engaged with that?
Yeah. So there's a couple of interesting connections there that I can see in what you're sharing, that there's this sense that for the leaders themselves, and these might be heads of schools or middle leadership within schools, or in your role, CEO of the peak body, there's the sense of you role modeling to the people around you. These are the things that I do. Like, we need to get up onto the balcony in order to see the patterns that are happening down on the dance floor. To switch analogy, we need to see the patterns in the ball of string and how we're going to untangle it. And there's a sense that actually the aim of the goal here is not to untangle the ball of string. The goal here is to figure out what's our next action. And the ball of string is highly unlikely to end up untangled at any point in the future. And it's helping people to feel comfortable with that, and that uncertainty, sitting in uncertainty and being comfortable in the uncertainty, and helping people to understand that it's not a failure of leadership to be unable to untangle the ball of string. It might be a failure of leadership to be able to articulate it's okay that we don't have full clarity at the moment. We do have full clarity about our next couple of steps, and we're going to learn. And boy, are we going to keep learning and keep agile and keep moving and kind of nimble in what we're doing. But there's that sense of doing it for yourself and then leading or role modeling.
I think it's probably been one of the changes in what the role of the leader is, where I think that notion of going, our role of the leader is to make everyone a leader, to me is maybe it's just me, but I think it has been a shift in the way, and I think it's where this idea of clarity came from, because once upon a time, the role of the leader was to give everyone else clarity over what we were doing and why. Why are we marching into battle? Why are we doing it this way? Okay, we're all clear. We'll follow you. You're the leader. Whereas now I think we have moved into a different world where the role of the leader is to provide clarity, but at the same time, it's to make everyone around you a leader. That's a much more challenging thing to do. And at the same, so you still have the crest for, I want clarity, I want you to give it to me. But at the same time, you're almost in opposition to that, saying, but I want you to do as I do, and go, that clarity is going to shift in 24 hours to being a completely different set of things. And here's why. That's the understanding. So we do operate, I think, in quite a different world to we were, perhaps 10 years ago. And one of the things that struck me, one of my daughters a few years ago was in the Scouts, and I looked at what the Scouts were doing compared to what I was doing when I was a Scout, and it's all leadership. So we are with very young people at a very young, embedding these concepts of what it is about to lead. And they're bringing that with them. And it's no surprise that we're becoming a workplace 6 years later or 7 years later, not to mention the fact that they go to a school where, again, leadership is a very, very important concept and a very, I hope, modelled concept in their school. That's what they bring into the workplace. And that's what we need to be responding to.
Yeah. It suddenly occurred to me as you shared that I don't think that the leaders that used to have all of the answers and the clarity, and then they give the clarity to everybody else, I suspect that those individual leaders never were 100% certain. There was always uncertainty, but they would have held it themselves. They would have been adept, for whatever reason, to take a risk, to say to themselves, or maybe a couple of deputies that they trusted, I'm not 100% sure, but we're going to go for it anyway. And then what they've communicated was, I'm 100% sure this is going to be wonderful. And of course, it didn't always work out, but when it did, it looked like there was a holy grail of certainty that gave clarity. And in actual fact, I suspect it was always masked by a couple of individuals, hopefully with the right reasons behind them, or maybe rather nefarious reasons in some cases, but who would then actually hold the uncertainty as individuals. I never thought about it that way before, but as you shared that example, I suspect it's never been as simple.
Nothing's ever simple.
Nothing's ever simple. Exactly. The voice of someone who works frequently with politicians. Yes. So there's this final trend, this final element I want to really pull out from our conversation before we wrap up our conversation, and it's this idea around influence without authority. And you've mentioned it already, that as CEO of the peak body, you're responsible for delivering certain shift and advocacy and kind of taking the sector in a particular direction. But basically, you have very little hierarchical authority to actually tell anyone else in the sector what to do. Have you found personal ways that you embody that sense of influencing others? What have you found works for you?
There are some qualities that I think if you don't have them, can't learn them, aren't prepared to bring to the table, will make life they'll make life very, very difficult if you are clear on what it is that you want to achieve. And so I think it probably goes back to our clarity discussion, doesn't it? I think the first of that is having some clarity of purpose. If you're not clear on what you're trying to achieve, then it's going to be very, very difficult to go into a challenge of trying to influence lots of people, because why am I doing it? What am I investing in? If I'm investing strength and time, and I think about lots of things, probably because of the political background. In advocacy, we talk about that notion of having a bucket of capital, and holding that concept very clear to go, when I'm doing this, if I'm making a withdrawal from that bucket because I'm taking a particular action or I'm upsetting someone, I've got to be really, really clear that that's what I'm doing. And I think in these roles, that concept of you're building a bucket of capital to be able to use it. So what does a bucket of capital look like? It's very relational. So building relationships is absolutely important. You've got to approach these roles going, if the first thing I need to do is actually build relationships. So in roles like mine, there's almost a bit of a playbook in Australia. Well, you'll start in the role and then you'll get on the plane and you'll go and visit each of your state and territory associations and you'll attend a board meeting and you'll tell them what you're doing and they'll eyeball you and go, that guy seems okay, or that guy's not going to last, whatever it might be. And then you kind of go back to the castle and get on with your work. And to me, I think I'm far more concerned about genuinely building relationships with the people, understanding what makes them tick, where have they come from, what's their background, what's going on, what problems are they trying to solve. I think having a genuine intent to actually do that and build that understanding and commit to that is really, really important. One of the other things I did in this role is I try to, as much as I can, if I'm going to have a meeting with one of our members in a state, I'll try to, as much as I can, connect that and go, can we go and look at some schools together? Because I've got to connect myself with their end user, with the reason I'm there. I'm there for schools and students ultimately. And I think that creates some sort of commonality to go, actually, we're doing this together. We're going to schools together. We're meeting principals together. We're hearing their concerns together. We can sit down and a principal can say, here's what I've got to tell you about my state and territory association. Here's what I've got to tell you about what you're doing nationally. So there's something in that I think is helpful, that shared experience. And I think the third thing is probably being willing to listen and actually hear what people have got to say. And I think we all understand it. I'm talking a podcast for educators, okay? So, I'm a very visual learner, but other people aren't. So in any group of 10 people that you're trying to influence, step back and be an educator and think, well, that one needs the data, that one needs a spreadsheet, that one needs the visual PowerPoint, that one needs to go away for 3 days and contemplate what you told them, reflect, come back, ask you another set of questions and be able to agree. So applying those things as well to those situations is important. So there's nothing there that we don't know, I think. It's just in the heat of battle, for lack of a better word. Sometimes, again, it's very easy to forget all those things and go, I want to get this done. It's patently obvious that's what we should be doing. You're blocking me. Get out of the way. And again, that's driven by, it's genuine. We do need to get it done. There is a deadline. There's 10 people on your team that just spent 100 hours working on this project that want to see it happen and don't want to spend a week waiting for 3 people to go away and contemplate, reflect, talk to their teams, come back. And so, it can be challenging, but I think they're things that we learn over time. I don't think it's that we don't know them. I think sometimes, being able, having the space to go, that's the thing I need to pull out of the toolkit and use, or those are the tools. We don't always have it. And I'm no different to anyone else. I get frustrated. I get annoyed. I get, why are you blocking me? Why are you blocking me? Stop. All those things come into it. But if I circle back to where I started, the most important thing in all of that is having a relationship that can withstand that. And it's the same in advocacy. The first thing we do is we build a relationship with the person we're going to have to influence, because you're going to be doing things where you need to go hard and you need to say things to that person that they're not going to like. And if you haven't built up that bucket, you can't take anything out of it. There'll be nothing left. So it's a very, very similar starting point, I think.
Yeah. A lot of it comes through to similar skills that we learn when we're learning how to be a leader, but then we're employing them in a situation which is much more intentionally thinking about bucket of capital, as you put it, which is a really nice, you said you're a visual thinker, it's a nice visual way of thinking about it. So it's all of the relationship building, the listening. If anyone ever says anything to me around, it's really obvious, that's a red flag immediately. Well, okay, who is it obvious to? Explain, if it wasn't obvious to someone, how would you explain it? Because that tends to be when someone hasn't taken the time to understand what it looks like from another person's point of view. No. And they're trying to go faster than they're going to really be able to take people with them. And you can bulldoze it through. Sometimes you have to, that's fine. But do it because that's the method you're going to use this time. Don't do it by mistake. And so understanding what it looks like from another person's point of view, from a different side of the table, is almost always a great way to go into building a relationship, understanding a difference of opinion around a board table. Yeah, and anything beyond assuming it's obvious, that's where you need to unpick.
Yeah, funny you say that, because one of my and I still remember it clearly, one of my lessons as a very, very young, I'll say manager, but I guess I was a leader, was I had a small team and there was one member of that team, and I was continually saying, I can't remember his name, but I'd say, look, Bob, let's do this. It's simple. And at one point, I thought this guy was going to hit me. Like, he literally turned around, stood up. I could see the anger on his face. I could see the frustration and the muscles clench. I almost thought he was going to punch me. And he said, Graham, stop saying it's simple. It's not simple. And it was exactly what you were saying. It was such a lesson to have someone, to put someone and push them so hard that had to be their reaction. It's a bit like you're saying, it's obvious. It wasn't obvious and it wasn't simple. And to have someone continually say it's simple, with the best of intentions. But yeah, it's one of those things. I remember it very, very clearly. It was probably 30 years ago. But yeah, it was an excellent example of what you're talking about, that it's very, very easy for us to think something's obvious, something's simple. Why can't we all see it that way? Yeah. But not everybody does. And they'll bottle it up, and you don't want it to explode.
Exactly. And at the end of the conversation, it may be that the thing that looks simple to you is absolutely the decision that ends up being made. But almost always it's worth having the conversation, even if it takes a couple of days to wait for people to review data and come back to you, because that's what's going to actually create the relationships that mean that you can move forward with pace after the decision's made. Yeah. So Graham, as we wrap up our conversation, what's the one thing you'd like people to take away from this conversation and take into the day that's ahead of them, or the week that's ahead of them? What's the core message that you've got for people here?
My first, I think I'd go back to where we started, that why me? Why am I sitting here talking to you on a podcast about education? That to succeed in increasingly complicated environments, this actually isn't about me. It's about the decision that independent schools Australia made to go, in this environment, we need a leader who has a particular set of skills, and that is about being able to influence and being able to shift what we see happening around us, and what we see as a risk. And whether it's looking at your team, whether it's looking at your whole organisation, whether it's looking at a board, whether it's looking at a sector, I think that ability to say the past was the past, the present is the present, and what is the future looking like, and what are the skills and the attributes that we need to be able to work with that, are critical to our thinking. And to me, I think I talked about that dilemma that we have currently about how do we protect the past, but at the same time, how do we start to shape a future? We need to make sure that we've got the talent, the skills, the attributes, the knowledge to make that happen. And that's not about hiring a CEO. That is about the way that we as a sector, in my case, the way that we are as an organisation, making sure that we are equipped to try and achieve that balance. And not always just think, here's the way it's happened in the past, here's what we need. That'll In fact, to me, I think it's almost falling the trap of going, because that'll make sure the past never changes. Now, we all continually, and I know that you in the UK have had a very recent, very clear lesson in that's not the way the world works, certainly not the way the world works politically. So how do we make sure that we are, as leaders, as sectors, as organisers, I'm actually making sure that we are equipping ourselves, yes, do the best we can to protect what we have when that is the right thing to do, but at the same time, let's make sure we're able to actually adapt and change and support when we're talking about schools and education, ultimately, and to support our schools, but ultimately to support our children, because the change is impacting them and our students. How do we actually make that happen? How do we do that in the right way?
Yeah, so there's something about making sure you've got the right people around the table, the right skill set. And there's also something about letting go a little bit, letting go of such a firm grip on the status quo in order to actually see the future, see different ways, different skills that you could have around the table. There's a letting go as well as a populating the table, the team. Yeah. Thank you so much, Graham, for your time today. It's been fascinating to hear about what's happening in Australia and in the sector, and also to hear a different point of view about advocacy and the impact that has on the complexity and uncertainty that we're leading in the school sector. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Juliet. It's been an absolute pleasure. Lovely talking to you.
Thank you for listening to the Independent School Podcast. If you found today's conversation valuable, I invite you to join my email list and hear more of my fresh thinking on leading strategically through complexity and uncertainty. Visit www.consultjuliet.co.uk/sign up. Remember, the biggest challenges you face are rarely solved by working harder. They're solved by thinking differently, with the right trusted advisor in your corner. While I work with leaders across many sectors, my heart and more than 2 decades of experience remain deeply rooted in education. If you're ready to turn complexity into progress, sharpen your focus, and lead a happier, higher performing team, I'd love to start a conversation about how we could work together. Just reach out anytime. And don't forget, the clearest insights often appear when you gift yourself a moment to slow down and let your best thinking surface.